thank you for sitting with me again, this time here in Istanbul. Last time, of course, in New York. How was Istanbul?
Istanbul's great.
Wonderful. So today I'm hoping to speak with you about, or rather drawing from your role as a political strategist, what your views of Hamas are and some of the myths that surround Hamas, as well as exploring some insights in a very interesting article that you provided me with before this interview regarding the necessity of a settlement between Hamas and Israel. So perhaps to start off, we can look at the kind of work that you were involved in the UK as a political strategist. You were operating at quite a high level, and what that kind of work sort of gave you a window into in terms of how the West views Hamas.
I mean, the most relevant work, beyond the fact that I've worked for mayors and prime ministers, it was the time I spent in the Middle East peace envoy, where I got to experience, West Bank, got to experience apartheid, got to see it firsthand. And what was really fascinating about that time was our direct conversations with, obviously Israel, direct conversations with PA at that time, which is Mahmoud Abbas's party, Fatah, but no conversation with Hamas, who at that point governed Gaza. And honestly, that if you were thinking about ever getting to a settlement, ever getting to what the West would call peace, it was a true mistake. I mean, even Tony Blair, who was the Middle East peace envoy, said it was a huge error not to engage with Hamas. And he said that after the role that he completed, a few years after the mission had been wrapped up. But the fact that wasn't an oversight, it was very deliberate, because there was no actual desire for a settlement. The Middle East Peace Envoy's office was set up, frankly, to appease Israel and make sure that they looked good, frankly, while, pretending to negotiate some form of peace, some sort of economic development for Palestinians, and help them create a state. But it was all a facade.
Right. And in this article, so people know, it wasn't published or hasn't been published yet, and there's a bit of a backstory with respect to that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I would really like to get into the ideas in this article in earnest with you, because they're so good.
Yes, so when I originally penned this article about the time to talk to Hamas, around the first ceasefire. If you remember, in December, Qatar had successfully negotiated a couple of weeks ceasefire between the Israeli occupation and Hamas. It gave Palestinians a little bit of relief. And, everyone was looking, frankly, for that to just continue and end the current onslaught by Israel. But Israel had no intention, as we all know, of continuing it after getting a handful of hostages. But at that time, it was an opportunity to open people's eyes to Hamas and the Palestinian resistance and what they actually stood for and what they were fighting for. And I penned an article for a Western newspaper in America who were interested in the idea. And because it framed Hamas as a political movement, frankly, which they are, a more nuanced organization than the West has portrayed them historically, they declined to publish it. Even though that once receiving it, they were excited originally, and then they declined to publish it. And I think it was endemic of what the Western media has been doing through this whole onslaught by Israel. They have been providing cover for genocide. So the idea that you would nuance Hamas, the idea that you would add color to a complicated organization that is a resistance group with a military wing, but also a political movement, was something that the Western media just couldn't publish at the time. It didn't fit the narrative that Israel were the good guys, and frankly, they frame Palestinians as all Hamas because they call Hamas a terrorist group. So it would undo their world that they have created for their consumers, for lack of a better term, and what the political elite in the US want the public to understand.
Right. And to your credit, in the article, you talk about dialogue, and I think it's very interesting because a lot of people, and I think understandably, have become disenchanted with this notion of dialogue because so often it's disadvantaged the Palestinian people from the outset. But you talk about the possibility of a constructive dialogue that actually honors Palestinian self-determination, sovereignty. I'm wondering if you can speak to that and what that would look like in reaching a settlement.
Well, you have to look at recent history, right? It's not like we haven't done this before, right? If we take a step back, right, we have talked to groups who the West, and I want to get specific, with Hamas even, there's about 28 countries that call them a terrorist organization. It's the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. It's not that many countries that recognize them as a terrorist. Everyone else recognizes them as a resistance group or a liberation group or a political movement, a bunch of freedom fighters, but also a political movement. So we have to context this, that most of the world sees them for what they actually are, a political movement with a military wing that resists its occupation. Birthed from occupation, like so many movements, birthed from the trauma of occupation, frankly, like so many movements before them. Think the ANC in South Africa, who had a military wing and a political wing. Think the IRA, who were occupied by the British. The British were brutal. Starvation. We talk about starvation a lot in Gaza right now. The Brits were the experts at starvation. They stole the Irish food and said it was a famine. Sounds very familiar to what's going on today. But again, we negotiated with the IRA and Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin was the political wing and the IRA was the military wing. So many other groups historically that had both of those elements to them, and they were resisting their occupation, which is, again, allowed in international law. I even think the recent ICJ ruling says that Hamas's resistance or Palestinian resistance groups' acts are justified under international law, and they put that in their advisory around the West Bank and the Gaza and Israel's occupation, that they are allowed to resist this. Now, what the premise of the article was that, like, you cannot put preconditions on any form of negotiation or settlement if you are looking to actually have assessment. Now, we've gone far beyond the timeline of this article, but at the time, what I was trying to articulate is Israel's only way of negotiating with Hamas at the time was they had to put all their arms down. They have to say violence, they would denounce violence, and then they can come to the table. Well, what is keeping Palestinians alive is the fact that they can resist, and part of that is armed resistance from all resistance groups within Palestine. The idea that they would put their arms down to come to the table with a fully armed military on the other side of the table, that they have no leverage. And we have had this, we've gone through this cycle in the past. I'll use the most recent one, again, the IRA. The British for years wanted them to disarm, but they realized they could only negotiate the Good Friday Agreement with Sinn Féin if the IRA were at the table, and they still had their arms at the time. Right? Why would the resistance to a brutal occupation ever put its arms down in the first place? A precondition meant you could not take Israel seriously when they were saying they wanted to negotiate, because they know the only thing keeping Palestinians alive was those resistance groups. And I'll give you a context. They had just done everything the way Palestinians have tried to do everything the West has wanted them to do, tried to negotiate peacefully. They got burned every time they do that with Oslo and everything else that goes before that. They even tried the Great March in Gaza, where they walked to the gates, the wall, and did it unarmed. And what's Israel's response to a peaceful march was to shoot people, have people amputated, in some cases kill people, and a peaceful march to the gate to ask to come home. They've tried everything the way the West wanted it.
Right.
So why would they put their arms down before any form of negotiation in the future?
Right. And just to be clear, what is it then that let's say the occupier, in the case of Israel, wants ultimately when they're asking for things like that, to put your arms down? What exactly is happening? It's not a dialogue.
Yeah, Israel is not coming to the table looking to actually settle. When they're doing that, they're putting Palestinians in a position where they have no power at all. They were already quietly genociding Palestine. I think Sinwar in an interview in 2021 said, they were doing a quiet genocide. They're killing us slowly, and you want us to be the quiet, good victim. And it's very telling that was Israel's agenda, because they knew that Hamas and other liberation groups were never going to put their arms down to come to the table, so there's never an opportunity to actually have a thorough negotiation if they ever wanted to get a settlement. And that was Israel's ploy, because they knew that was the scenario, right? So Israel's never been a fair actor in this, and they knew the United States, being as biased as it is, still had their preconditions of not negotiating with terrorist groups directly. Well, the problem is Hamas was elected, should never have been put on the terror list, and the terror list has been abused, right? The terror list is about also framing a whole population. Right? Terrorists, from the United States point of view, is a justification to never treat a population the same way. It's a justification for domestically in the United States to target a population, internationally to bomb a population. Like they did this with Iraq too, right? They framed Iraq as Saddam Hussein so they could invade. Could have taken out Saddam Hussein and left Iraq alone if that's what they really cared about, but they framed Iraq as Saddam Hussein. He was a threat to global security with what WMDs that didn't exist. And they did the same with Hamas. You put them on a terror list, you frame the population as Hamas, and you justify genocide in that process.
And you sort of allude to it in the article. I'm wondering what, if you can use this word, winning, what does Israel believe it's winning in doing all this?
Yeah, Israel's ultimate goal is to ethnically cleanse Palestine and effectively wipe its existence off the map. Not just its people, its very existence. When they're trying to do this, they are trying to. Somebody called it to me. It's not just a genocide. It's a healthicide. It's all the things. It's like all the academic institutions are gone. All its history is gone. If you look at what's left of Gaza right now, they are trying to shred every form of existence, all historical landmarks, all academic institutions, all books. They are burning books, reminiscent of the Nazis. They are destroying everything that's anything to do with Palestinian cultures like they never existed. And here's the difference between this and apartheid in South Africa. The white supremacist regime in South Africa needed its black population to work, for their economy to work, even if there was apartheid, which was a tragic crime. The difference between that and Israel, because people compare them so accurately, it is apartheid. But Israel doesn't want they want to exterminate Palestinians so they can say there was never apartheid because there were never Palestinians.
Right.
That is their form of winning.
I partly asked the last question because I feel in the article you sort of allude to it that, not that this is the paramount concern, but that it's also not in Israel's interest to resist a settlement or the possibility of reaching a settlement. And I wonder if you can comment a bit on that.
Israel doesn't have a path forward if they don't try and have a settlement. And the reality is Israel, since even writing the article, has shown the world that it's not that it is trying to commit genocide. It's openly doing it. They talk about it at minister level, at societal level. 86% of the population support this. 17% of them support starvation. They're in a very sick place. I've got no other words for that. It's a very sick society at that point. And Israel needs a settlement because Israel won't exist, frankly. Because when this is all done right now, there is no way for Israel to come back to the table in any way as a country to the world. The whole world can see who they are. The only reason they haven't been totally isolated right now is the United States of America. But if you think about what's already happened without any sanctions, really, without any global consensus that they should be, I say global, the rest of the world wants to sanction Israel. Again, Europe and America are the only thing stopping that. And America primarily because it's using its economic and military power everywhere to keep everybody at bay, right? The reality is Israel will only exist if they come to the table. Because I don't believe, a lot of people, they're walking themselves into their own doom right now. They can't actually win a fight with Hamas because it's not a group of fighters. It's a movement. It's literally a political movement that more and more people align themselves with every day. They, to the north, have a fully functioning army in Hezbollah who, last time they went into direct conflict with Hezbollah, Israel tucked its tail between its legs and ran back down the border because Hezbollah hit one of their ships with an anti-ship missile. Right? They can't do a direct conflict with an actual army. They can only bomb innocent civilians, only bomb women and children. They can only capture people with nothing to do with anything and torture them. That's all Israel knows how to do. And Israel only can do this with superior firepower. Because anytime they get into direct conflict with Hamas and Gaza, we've seen the videos for ourselves, they lose. There's no celebratory videos from Israelis when they take out Hamas fighters because they probably haven't killed that many, frankly. They have literally spent the last 10 months massacring civilians and innocent human beings and have picked off very few Hamas fighters. Now, if they continue this, they're walking themselves into self-destruction. So it's in Israel's best interest for its own survival, if it wants to survive, frankly, to go back to the table.
Yes. And these powers that you were mentioning earlier, a minority of powers in the world that regard Hamas as quote unquote a terrorist entity or group, these are also places where the younger generations are appreciating the truth of Hamas's resistance movement. At the same time, though, within these societies, this myth, the terrorist myth continues to circulate. And I'm just wondering, as a political strategist, knowledgeable and effective modes of communication, how that happens and perhaps how that can be challenged on a broad scale.
The interesting thing for me is it's kind of amazing, I think, because obviously I wasn't around when the Vietnam movement happened and too young to really remember apartheid. But the similarities between kids and understanding what something is, like the ANC not being a terrorist organization prescribed by the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK,
Yes.
Was very easy for them to see. They see things truthfully with no bias built into it, right? They see it so honestly, and they're doing that again, and they're going to teach. They're going to teach people around them, educate people around. Yes, there's always people who are going to frame people as terrorists or have their own built-in views from years upon years of bad press and bad press by journalism. Let's not be not bad press for Hamas, bad press by journalists who framed the group a certain way, or frame the ANC a certain way, frame the IRA a certain way. Yeah, these groups have all been framed by the Western media a certain way. So obviously you're going to have maybe a generation that can't be moved.
Right.
Doesn't mean the rest of people can't be, the rest of the public can't be moved. There are people who don't know. So all the people learning about this and understanding the complexity of this are actually educating people around them by just continuing to talk about it, right? There is no, and the interesting thing about all of this, we are more interconnected than we ever have been because of the cell phones we have, because of the platforms we use. Those people talking about it in the belly of the beast of the empire in the United States or in Europe, people who have to fight the hardest fight that's not in Gaza, right? People who have to fight that in places that are frankly putting down students for like protesting for a ceasefire. Those people communicating that have allies all around the world because the other 160 odd countries in the world are supportive of Palestinians. So they can they can know they're doing this with the knowledge that the rest of the world's behind them. And the minority are those Western nation leaders and a whole generation that doesn't understand this. And it's interesting because they have used, I take the United States, for example, right? When I think about the people operating within the United States to get a ceasefire and an arms embargo, they're not asking for much, by the way. They're not even ending the occupation at this point, which is what I think everyone wants to end. But they are fighting every tool of the state. Think about this. They are an extension of resistance. They are fighting the president's office. They're fighting politicians and political leaders who are calling them agents of China and Russia because they are sympathetic to Palestinians and a resistance movement. That's what they're calling them, agents of another country. And do you know why they call them that? Because those politicians can't imagine doing anything that's not paid, because that's all they do. They receive money and lobby for the people they get paid by, right? And they have to go against the media, who have framed people as members of KKK groups, who they're similar to Nazis because they're demonstrating on behalf of Palestinians. They have gone against everything, and they're still resisting.
Right.
There is power in their movement, and it can grow every day the more they stand up to all these institutions that are trying to put them down. Now, the reality is we are going through now a period of transition as well with Hamas. They're going to have to put a new political leader in, right? And my suggestion to the West and its leaders is get to the table directly with that leader, because there's not going to be a settlement that you want without talking to that individual, because you have shown no courage, no decency, no balance by letting Israel assassinate the political leader of another group who was not a terrorist, never partook in those terrorist acts, and has always was their prime minister at one point in Gaza. So if you've allowed that, you have a lot of work to do to show you can be a balanced player at a negotiation table with any future self.
This is actually a perfect segue for this question I needed to ask. So we talked about the danger of preconditions, but conditions for dialogue itself, what does that look like when it comes to Hamas, Israel,
Well, right now, I think my conditional dialogue, Israel has to end its, obviously its bombardment of Gaza and the West Bank, because it's currently bombing the West Bank too. Israel has to retract its troops from both sets of territories to actually have a fair dialogue at this point. It has to end its occupation. And actually, the precondition needs to be on Western leaders. The preconditions need to not just be on Israel on this. I think those are the two preconditions that need to be met. Hamas should not be asked, or any resistance group, to put down their arms. They're not a full military. If you ask one side that had to keep its military, you cannot expect Hamas or the resistance groups to put their arms down too. So they need to remove themselves from those territories to get back to the table. However, the conditions need to be also in the West, right? The United States cannot be the broker. It has shown itself to be unable to be balanced, fair in any of this. If the United States wants to sit at the table, it should be sitting next to Israel. The brokers of this world need to be picked from a group of people who have, I wouldn't say no skin in the game, but have shown their consistency in pursuit of justice. I would argue South Africa, some of the South American countries, like people in the global South who have shown that their only pursuit of this is the protection of lives of people, who've shown that they care about prevention of a genocide, who show that they care about a fair settlement for all people. They should be leading the negotiation. Countries like that, there are probably more that you could add to that. Should not be the West, should not be the United States of America. And frankly, the other countries around the world, to prevent this, if this is not going to stop in any immediate time, need to start taking action as well, right? We're at a tipping point where Israel's bombing people in tents, no buildings left, right? The massacres are getting worse again. And the reality is, all these countries have a lot of power. The only thing holding them back is this myth that America is going to retaliate in some way to them, whether it's through economic sanctions or militarily. But, they can't continue to do this endlessly either. And the reality is, like, you take a Turkey where we're sitting in right now, right? It's a NATO member, and a NATO member could actually stand there and create a blockade. Turkey could blockade Israel tomorrow, and it would economically crush them. But these leading African nations right now, who are slowly decoupling themselves from the United States, could then trade with Israel. We don't need to wait for the UN. We don't need to wait for the ICJ. We don't need to wait for ICC arrest warrants for countries and their populations to act. And if the countries are not acting, I ask populations to get on the backs of your leaders. Like, this is a once in a lifetime humanitarian a call for humanity, to protect humanity. Because it's our whole future that we're protecting with this. Like, we let this happen. This is what our ruling class wants for a lot of people. When I say our ruling class, I mean the American administration and their allies. They want to show this is, if you mess with them, frankly, this is what the reaction's going to be. It's time for the world to push back a little bit. And if your government's not moving fast enough, get your government to move. Institute trade blockades. Institute actual physical blockades. But also, demand that the businesses in your country don't work with Israel. That's an even easier ask. Yes. It's easier to get businesses to, when you publicly shame them, when you bring it out that they are trading with an apartheid regime that's committing a genocide, how quickly they will turn around and stop that work. Also, you could boycott them to stop it. And the danger of the boycott, the danger of their capital going down is too risky for most companies. Look what happened to Starbucks and McDonald's. The population can mobilize to stop this right now. Now, going back to your question about, like, the preconditions, like, my genuine conditions are this. Israel has to leave the West Bank and Gaza. It has to end its occupation and end its current onslaught. The West cannot be in the negotiator. Can never be the negotiator again. On this specific thing, they have not been balanced. Three of the biggest powers in the West, from Germany, the UK, and the United States, are complicit and aiding and abetting this genocide. They should be in the court with Israel, answering those crimes. So they can't be at the table unless they sit next to Israel. The negotiators have to be people from the global South who show that primary focus is protecting human lives.
It's a really, I feel, important point you're making, because it's like saying we need to look at the historical record. This has happened too many times.
Yeah.
We've given the West too many chances. Like, we've been charitable, to use that word.
Yeah.
We've been charitable. We've given the West the chance to broker, to mediate, but every time they do it, it's always framing Palestine as the one that needs to change, that they're doing something wrong. And Israel's doing nothing. No, nothing wrong.
Yeah.
But Ashish, thank you so much for this very illuminating conversation. I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts or observations.
Yeah.
Share.
I mean, for me, with an impending regional crisis potentially with Israel assassinating Hania, assassinating a Lebanese leader, as a Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, the reality is the only way Israel has responded ever in a way that protects lives is sadly when other sides have force. I think about Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah's statement where he said, we want to respect international law. We will let you do the legal process with the ICJ. But remember, the only time Israel left Lebanon is when we were armed and we could push them out of Lebanon. And in 2006, everyone will remember the only reason Israel went back with its tail tucked between its legs is because Hezbollah had an anti-ship missile and knocked a ship out. The reality is the resistance is the only thing, I go back to that point, that has kept Palestinians, Lebanese, and other people alive from Israel's onslaught, its genocidal intent in the whole region. So asking any of them to disarm while this, frankly, occupying force is there, who has no intent but destroying the land and destroying its people, is something the West could never ask its people. And it wouldn't ask its own people, frankly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ashish. And I do hope that article actually gets published because it will surely advance the dialogue and the struggle.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.